Welcome to this video in our Committer Orientation series. In this video, I'm going to talk about the use of artificial intelligence by Eclipse committers and contributors. First, a quick note. This content is for illustrative purposes only. None of this should be considered legal advice. If you require legal counsel, please consult with your own attorney. Please keep in mind that this is a rapidly evolving area. Consequently, this advice may and likely will change as the technology and legal landscape progress. This is not a how-to guide. Our goal with this session is not to teach you how to use AI. We are specifically not discussing important issues like the ethical use of AI. We recommend that you work with your employer, colleagues, and teammates to identify specific training on the responsible use of artificial intelligence. Our focus is entirely on governance and our obligations to adopters, developers, users, and the community at large. Note that your employer may have guidelines that impact your use of artificial intelligence when engaged in open source activities. This is between you and your employer. Think of AI as a tool to supercharge your workflow, not do the job for you. We want it to handle the mundane tasks so you can focus on the big ideas. We've crafted the Generative Artificial Intelligence Usage Guidelines for Eclipse Committers to provide you with some guidance regarding the use of AI tools in your open source project. You can find the guidelines in the Artificial Intelligence section of the Eclipse Project Handbook. I've provided a link here. If you use generative AI, we need 3 things from you: transparency, compliance, and verification. First, know your tool. Understand its limits and what it was trained on. Second, protect the ecosystem. Use the platform's built-in checks to flag intellectual property issues or security bugs. Third, double-check everything. AI hallucinations are real. As a committer, the code or content is ultimately your responsibility, so make sure that generated content does what you think it does. Bottom line, track your tools, quote your sources, and let's innovate responsibly. In addition to the Generative Artificial Intelligence Usage Guidelines for Eclipse committers, the normal committer responsibilities, as described by the Eclipse Committer Due Diligence Guidelines, apply. Contributions must be vetted for correctness and alignment with the project's scope and goals. Contributions should be reviewed to ensure that they do not contain obvious vulnerabilities. And you must engage in intellectual property due diligence review. If you are concerned that content may have been copied, is substantially similar to someone else's content, or that a contributor is otherwise not operating in good faith, contact the IP team for help and advice. These responsibilities exist independent of whether the content is generated by a human or a machine. As a committer, you bear responsibility to ensure that contributions, whether generated by a human or an AI, are correct. Ultimately, as a committer, you must decide whether or not you will accept a merge or pull request. For the purposes of contributions made with the assistance of AI, we'll focus on project content. Content that is developed by an Eclipse committer, with or without AI assistance, can just be pushed into project repositories without additional consideration or review, subject, of course, to the project team's rules. Committers who work for a member company that has signed the member committer and contributor agreement can generally merge pull requests created by their colleagues who are working under the same agreement without additional consideration or review. As exceptions to the above, when a contribution is forked from another source, content is distributed under a license that is different from the project license, or the content contains cryptographic algorithms, you should engage with the IP team to review and track the contribution before you merge it. Additionally, when a contribution is received from a contributor who is not a committer and does not work for the same member company as a committer, you must engage with the IP team for review when the contribution contains more than 1,000 lines of code, or you have concerns about the contribution. If you are concerned that content may have been copied, is substantially similar to someone else's content, or that a contributor is not operating in good faith, contact the IP team for help and advice. Committers must also engage in intellectual property due diligence review for third-party libraries and assets leveraged by the project content. This includes things like Maven or Node module dependencies. Intellectual property concerns are discussed further in our Intellectual Property Due Diligence Process training module. As a vendor-neutral Eclipse open source project, the EMO expects that your project team will foster an environment in which everyone plays by the same set of rules. This doesn't necessarily mean that your project team needs to accept every single contribution that comes their way. Rather, it means that you need to have a set of rules by which everyone participates, and these rules can't include things like for whom a contributor works. At a minimum, all contributions to your Eclipse open source project should fall within your project's scope and current development plan. Your team may decide to have rules that require that all code contributions be accompanied by unit tests and documentation, or that contributions implement a solution for an issue that's been discussed in the project's issue tracker. Some sort of quality bar is a reasonable part of any set of contribution rules. As a committer, you bear responsibility to ensure that the contributions that you receive are technically correct, are compatibly licensed, don't include obvious vulnerabilities, and align with your project's scope and plans. As a committer, you should not accept contributions human or AI generated that you can't reasonably review, don't understand, or are willing or able to support. If you need help, contact the IP team. As a committer, you bear responsibility for taking reasonable precautions to avoid accepting contributions, either human or AI generated, that contain content that has been copied from other sources. What constitutes reasonable precautions? In your own work, you can ensure that your tools are configured to avoid directly copying content or offering snippets that are extracted verbatim from training data. If you suspect that something has been copied or are concerned that someone's copyright is violated by a contribution, contact the IP team for assistance. Let's move on to the specifics of copyright and licensing as they relate to these new tools. I am not a lawyer, and this is not legal advice. Be aware that our advice on this topic may change. Under current legal standards, copyright protection is strictly reserved for works created by human beings, as the law requires human authorship to grant intellectual property rights. While AI-generated content, much like photographs taken by animals or of natural formations, cannot be copyrighted in its raw form, humans may still claim protection for original elements they add, such as specific arrangements, significant edits, or accompanying text. Essentially, while the machine's output is most likely not copyrightable, the human's creative selection and arrangement, or transformative modifications, are what the law recognizes and protects. Deciding to add AI-generated content to your open-source project may be considered curation. That act of curation is copyrightable. Take note, though, that your copyrightable acts do not change the copyright of the content that you manipulate. That is, making changes or arranging content adds your copyright. It does not give you the right to take overall ownership of the work. A full discussion of the subtleties of copyright law across multiple jurisdictions is out of scope for this discussion. If you want to know more, speak with your lawyer. The Creative Commons Zero, or CC0 dedication, is a legal tool that allows creators to waive all copyright and related rights in their works, placing them as completely as possible in the public domain. CC0 is not a license in the traditional sense. It is a public domain dedication. Using Creative Commons Zero to designate artificial intelligence-generated content as public domain is a recommended proactive practice for clarifying the status. As AI-generated content often lacks a, quote, significant degree of human creativity required for copyright protection, applying CC0 serves as a waiver of potential rights. There is no current standard for identifying the AI assistant. This area is evolving, but a de facto standard of using assisted by tags seems to be gaining momentum within the open source community. We'll talk more about this in a bit. Reasonable effort should be undertaken to disclose the use of AI in project content. For files that are largely or entirely generated by an AI, add a standard copyright header expressing the project's license, along with an AI disclosure is evolving as an accepted standard. An AI disclosure will identify the AI assistant or assistants and summarize how AI supported the work. The summary should state, for example, whether the content is entirely, largely, or partially generated by an AI. To the extent possible, summarize the prompt or other relevant information to give adopters a reasonable chance of understanding where the content come from so that they can make their own risk assessment. In this example, we've identified a legal entity responsible for modifying or curating the content. We're showing a very standard copyright statement that includes the word copyright, the C in a circle, the year that the content was created, and the identity of the copyright holder. Many projects have adopted contributors to the Eclipse Foundation as the identity of the copyright holder. That works here as well. The header reflects the same license as the rest of the project content. In this example, we've expressed that the license is the Eclipse Public License, version 2.0 in the usual manner. We then provide an AI no rights reserved disclosure and dedication. This is presented here as a template. In application, our expectation is that you would indicate the extent of the contribution and select one of entirely, largely, or partially, and indicate the name of the AI assistant. Our practice is that all source files include an SPDX license identifier tag in the header, and AI-generated content is no exception. However, in this case, the SPDX expression combines project license and dedication. In an SPDX identifier expression, a conjunctive "and" means that the adopter must accept the terms of both sides of the expression. Finally, we've added an assisted by tag to capture the identity of the AI assistant. So, the question that's most likely on your mind is this: do I have to disclose every use of AI? The short answer is no. The slightly longer answer is probably not. It is cumbersome and unnecessary to disclose minor or insignificant contributions. A spelling correction, the addition of a control structure, generation of boilerplate content that you modify. These sorts of minor contributions most likely do not rise to the level of requiring disclosure. However, the generation of an entire file, complete functions and methods, and interesting or creative behavior likely does rise to that level. Where is the line? At what point does generated content switch from minor to significant? The short answer is that we don't know. This is a continuously evolving space, and the line between minor and significant is fuzzy. There is a notion of de minimis in law. Essentially, the law does not concern itself with trifling matters. Nobody cares that you used an AI to generate some support functions, to add a word, or build some scaffolding or boilerplate content. We acknowledge that this is hard. As a simple metric, when it's not especially onerous to do so, it's probably not wrong to include a disclaimer on AI-generated content. It would certainly be cumbersome to try to annotate individual lines of code, and doing so likely doesn't serve anyone's interests. If you feel that doing so would be useful, consider isolating generated content into individual commits, an extension of the practice of keeping commits focused on specific activities. We've observed practice of including an AI disclosure in commit messages. This is the most machine-readable way to handle it for automated audits. Much like everything else in this space, this is evolving rapidly, and our advice will almost certainly change. As of this recording, there is no current standard for identifying the tool or agent used to generate content. This area is evolving, but a de facto standard of specifying the name of the tool in plain text with a more technical identifier or URL in parentheses seems to be gaining momentum. Over time, we will have more specific advice to give in this area. In the meantime, please do your best. Consider adding documentation to your project that describes the project team's values and practices with regard to content that is generated by artificial intelligence. It can be helpful to have a formal statement of policy and values that you can reference in cases where you decide to, for example, reject a contribution. This is another rapidly evolving space, but creating an AI policy.md is emerging as a valuable means of providing guidelines that regulates the use of artificial intelligence in code contributions, issue creation, and community discussions. It ensures human accountability and prevents automated clutter or low-quality vibe coding. The Intellectual Property Due Diligence Process training module provides a lot of information regarding our IP policy and processes. If you have a contribution that requires review, suspect that a contribution may have been inappropriately copied, believe that your licensed content may have been inappropriately copied, believe that a contributor is intentionally or unintentionally operating in bad faith, or have other concerns regarding intellectual property management, contact the IP team. Thank you for watching this orientation on AI usage for committers. By following these guidelines, you help keep the Eclipse ecosystem healthy, transparent, and compliant. Please reach out to the EMO if you have any further questions.